wish that all of you could have witnessed the late afternoon parade of snow-white steamboats leaving Baltimore and caught in the slanting rays of a setting sun. Could have stood on the freight deck and peered into the engine room and heard a ka-ch, ka-ch of the steam escaping from the machinery as the walking beam rocked back and forth high above. Could have lain in your stateroom berth and heard throughout the night the cries of sheep, cattle, pigs, one deck below, or the slap of a paddle wheel on the water, or a bellboy fading astern, or the steamer blowing for the next landing. Or could have stood on a country wharf for what seemed like hours before sighting the smoke and then the stack of the steamer coming around the next bend. If you could have seen all these things, you never would have forgotten the spell of it all. I think steamboating on the bay can be broken down into four categories. First, the route to Norfolk in the south. Secondly, the route to Philadelphia in the north. Thirdly, the many excursion lines. And last, and to me the most exciting, the many overnight river lines that covered all of the tributaries of the bay. There were 35 tributaries of the bay, that is, rivers, bays, and creeks emptying directly into the bay, that were served by steamboat. And there were over 125 steamboat landings on the eastern shore of the bay and over 150 on the western shore. First, the Norfolk route. Although the first steamer to Norfolk was in 1817, there wasn't any really large line until the Baltimore Steam Packet Company was formed in 1840 with a few steamers. They had no competition. They had bought out an earlier line until the time of the Civil War when a rival line from New York came in. They bought them out after a couple of years and again continued without any competition until 1896 when the Chesapeake line came in and was its main competitor, with each line having a boat to and from Norfolk every night until 1941 when the Old Bay line bought out the Chesapeake line. The Old Bay line lasted until 1962, at which time it was the only overnight passenger and freight line running between two cities in North America. Secondly, the Philadelphia route. The first steamboat on the bay was the Chesapeake, built in 1813, and she ran up to Frenchtown on the Elk River, and then you took a stagecoach to the Delaware and caught a steamboat to Philadelphia. In the early 40s, a steam engine and tracks replaced the stagecoach. The line prospered, built larger steamers, but then by the early 1850s ran into a lot of competition from the newly opened Chesapeake, not newly opened, but Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, which was new as far as through service was concerned, and also from the railroad from Wilmington to Baltimore. And they went out of business in the middle 1850s. Now the canal was opened in 1829 with 3 locks between Chesapeake City and Delaware City, including those two. St. George's was the other one. You have to remember that the canal the locks were only 22 feet wide, and the only thing you could get through there were tiny screw steamers, and there weren't any then. Side wheelers, which had a big extension over their paddle wheels, couldn't get through the locks. So they ran to Chesapeake City, and then people took a barge towed by a mule through to Delaware City and then steamer to Philadelphia. But in 1829, the Erickson line, Baltimore and Philadelphia Steamboat Company, commonly known as the Erickson line, had built for them tiny little screw steamers, only 21 feet wide, so they could get through the locks, and then you had a direct route to Philadelphia. They prospered and built larger steamers. Late 1890s, actually had a day line each day through the canal to Philadelphia, including the night line. And they went out of business in 1940. The third category,
Hold on just a minute. I want to third line, you were ready to
The third line would be the various excursion lines out of Baltimore. Prior to 1860s, they were just trips down the river into the bay with martial or cotillion music band aboard, but they didn't land anywhere. They just went down for the day and turned around and came back. By the middle 60s, there was an excursion resort at White Rock Retreat in Rock Creek, and then later, 70s, Holly Grove, where the Bethlehem Steel Company plant is now, and then later, Bay Ridge. In the early 90s, Love Point at the tip of Kent Island, Betterton at the head of the bay. But the most famous excursion line was the Tolchester Company. Now, prior to the date they were formed, in about 1877, liquor was served on board all steamers, and some of the excursion people could get a little bit rowdy. In fact, it got so bad at one time when the steamer came into Shadyside in West River, the townsmen came out with loaded guns to keep the passengers from coming ashore because they'd been tearing up their lawns and raising hell as they went through. The Tolchester Company established a strict policy of no liquor on board, and that appealed, of course, to ladies who could, in safety, take their children on an all-day excursion to Tolchester. The line prospered and expanded to Miles River, Little Choptank River, Annapolis and the lower rivers, the head of the bay, Sassus River and Susquehanna River. Went into bankruptcy in 1936, but was succeeded by several companies that kept going to 1962, and that was the end of Tolchester and the end of all excursion lines on the bay. Now the fourth category, and to me the most exciting, were the many, many river lines that left Baltimore in the late afternoon, went down overnight, went up the various rivers, creeks, making landings back and forth to the head of navigation. At the onset, 1817, there was a line established to the Weems line to Annapolis and the lower Patuxent River, and then by the late 20s and going on up through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, other lines came in covering all the other rivers of the bay. Most of the early enterprises were just a single operation, a one-man ownership, or maybe incorporated with one or at the most two steamers. But then, in the middle 1860s, there were definite lines established with fleets of steamers. The Chester River Steamboat Company to the Chester River, the Maryland Steamboat Company to the Choptank River and Anticoke, the Yanktank River, Eastern Shore Steamboat Company to the Crisfield on the lower eastern shore. Stop. Can you stop it now? Can you stop it?
yes.
Let's see what you say. By the middle 60s, I said that these various lines were established, but then in 1894 and again in 1905, the Pennsylvania Railroad, through a secret ownership that nobody knew that they were the real owners, established two lines that bought up all of the overnight river lines, and they continued on. I would say that 1912 would be the peak of steamboat operations on the bay to the various rivers. From then on, the decline was gradual, not hardly noticeable at first until the final crushing blow in 1932, when the Pennsylvania Railroad gave up all the river lines. Two companies came in, one on the eastern shore, one on the western shore, and had a couple steamers each, and carried on for another 6 or 7 years, and that was the end of the river lines.
Part of that was relative to the Depression, was it?
Now, the reason for that was that starting in the 20s, before that you had oyster shell roads. That's about all they had down there, and no automobiles, of course. And Baltimore was the lifeline of all these communities. The only way they could get supplies, they would ship down farm equipment, fertilizer, store products, and coming back you'd have fruit and grain from the Chester River section, tomatoes from the Cambridge section, Salisbury section, potatoes from the lower eastern shore, tobacco from the lower Potomac and Patuxent rivers, and of course seafood, oysters, fish, crab from all over the bay. The traffic was so heavy back then that in addition to the regular schedule line to the various places, sometimes they'd have to put on 2 or 3 extra steamers to go down to a landing where the carts with produce coming to Baltimore will be lined up for a half a mile along the road. But then, of course, in the early 20s, the roads improved, trucks started to come along, and that was the start of and the Depression didn't help either, end of the line.
Stand by one here. Well, the Depression had quite an effect on a lot of things. And the new series that's on PBS now in the evenings about the Depression has been revealing to me, because I was born in the Depression like that, and it was a time that I knew nothing about, and so it's kind of interesting. The various. Is she still talking to me? Well, somehow or other that battery. Would you run out and get a couple more, please? You talked about screw ships or screw steamers on the canal. What was the first screw steamer on the bay?
Exclusive of the Philadelphia run.
Exclusive of that.
Probably in the 1870s. Do
you remember what it was?
It was a freighter of the old Bay Line. I can't think of the name. I will in a minute. Yeah.
But the screw steamers had a disadvantage, didn't they? I mean, one of the advantages of the side wheelers was the fact that they could travel in shallower waters.
Yes. Matter of fact, and going up into like Pocomoke River, you had to go over a very shallow bar, and the engineer on the side wheeler would work the bar. You know, they'd get her going by releasing the bar, and the wheels would start to turn. But he just moved that thing back and forth just enough to keep the wheels slowly moving until she got over the bar. But they could get in much more shallow places.
And what diameter were the paddle wheels?
Well, some of the big side wheelers. What do you mean diameter?
They were huge on the side of the ship.
They went way up over the top deck. Yeah, the paddle box. Yeah, they were real big. And later, they had enclosed paddle boxes. The wheels were smaller.
Yeah. Some of the paddle boxes were quite ornate.
Ornate. Oh yes, all kinds of blues, yellows, orange, reds.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Tolchester Line and the Tolchester Beach? That was pretty famous, wasn't it?
You want me to start off something on the other, and then I'll come back to that.
Wish.
The meals on the Norfolk steamers were absolutely fabulous. You'd go down for dinner, and your first course would be crab cocktail or clams on the half shell, then vegetable soup or clam chowder, and then pan perch or rockfish. We haven't gotten to the main course yet. Then the main course, you'd have your choice of steak, sirloin steak, or lamb chops, or half a broiled chicken, or can't think of the other one. One minute, it was another course there. Then of course all the extras, coffee, dessert. Cost $1. You know, they had the nerve to raise it to $1.25 after even early 20s. But now the meals on the little river steamers, of course, nothing like that, but they were good and substantial, but not luxurious. You go down to dinner on, say, the Eastern Shore on the Crisfield run, and the waiter would sidle up to you and say, "There's ham and lamb and oyster fritters, and I expect with your soft-boiled eggs, you'll have maple syrup on your corn cakes." That would be 50 cents. I used to tell you one other thing before we get to Tolchester line. I used to wander around the freight deck, and of course, even before that, when the steamer was coming to the landing, passengers would line the rails and watch the colored deckhands using hand trucks going down a little gangplank, no sides on it, taking freight on or off, and doing fancy steps and singing to impress the passengers up above. And then I used to wander down on the freight deck. Passengers normally weren't allowed down there, but I was a boy. Nobody said anything to me. I'll never forget one time. I was walking down on the car to freight deck, freight pile up all around, and the group of the deckhands were, sometimes they shot crap, but this time they were playing poker. And I was standing there watching them, and this biggest and blackest man I've ever seen in my life, and he must have had a stroke of bad luck, because he nudged the guy next to him and looked up at me and pointed up at me and said, "Man alive, that boy must have $5 worth of gold in his mouth." I was wearing braces. I got out of there real fast.
Well, you, as a boy, your father was in the lumber business. Can
Yes.
you tell us a little bit about that in your travels?
He was in the lumber business, and not the type of lumber you use for sawmills. They would go down, and he'd either buy up a tract, his company would buy up a tract of timber that's either on the eastern or western shore, or occasionally just rent it to take out a certain number of trees. And these were loblolly pines. Of course, they're still down all over the eastern shore. And they would cut those things, some of them 60 feet high, and then they'd get an cart with oxen, tow them to the nearest water, and then a tug would come down and tow them to Baltimore. Now, they were used for bridge foundations, and a lot of them were transshipped by barge to New England, but they weren't cut up for normal lumber business. So when I was a boy and on summer vacation, school vacation, I'd go along with him. I guess starting about 1917, and that's how I got interested in the steamers.
Now, he did not own any steamboats, did he?
No.
He just leased them, or he just ran his...
Oh,
his
no,
cargo
we
on?
just went down as passengers,
And
and to wherever he was going to look at this tract of timber. Might be a Tank River, might be the lower eastern shore, and then, or Cambridge, around Cambridge. And then he'd go and inspect the things, decide what he wanted, and then he had helpers down there who would cut the trees down and tie them up, chain them up, and tow them to the nearest water. Then he would hire a tug to take them to Baltimore.
where would they take them in Baltimore?
Canton.
In Kent?
They would come in Canton.
Well, Salisbury in that area was quite a lumbering area for
Yes.
a number of years.
Yes, it was.
I remember reading about that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any interesting experiences other than the one you mentioned about, as a boy riding on steamboats?
Well, it's a lot of fun sometimes to see two steamers racing down the bay, and now, of course, racing was not supposed to be done. If you had one steamer much faster, incidentally, there's river steamers made from 10 to 14 miles an hour. The Norfolk steamers, 18 miles an hour. So if one was much faster than the other, it wasn't any race, of course, but if you had two steamers maybe 12 miles an hour, one might have a more or less freight than the other, or a better grade of coal, and as it would inch by the other one, the deckhands would throw over a rope. They were give a tow to the other steamer, and laugh and get back and forth.
The bay was an artery of commerce,
Sure.
and after the clippers and the boats that used to have sails kind of disappeared due to the onset of steamboats in the mid-1800s. I mean, serious.
Yeah.
Steamboats really were, most of them were cargo vessels, weren't they?
You mean the steamers?
Steamers, yeah.
That was their prime source of income. but they carried passengers. The average river steamer would carry about 80 passengers. A few of them had an extra deck and carried more. They ranged in length from 125 feet to 200 feet, whereas the Norfolk steamers were 300 feet long.
And you saw the city of tell us a little bit about the time you went down there and photographed the city of Richmond and the city of Norfolk coming into Baltimore Harbor for their, I think was their last.
Well, in 1941, when the Old Bay Line bought out the Chesapeake Line, normally their Chesapeake Line steamers, the city of Richmond, city of Norfolk, would have been scrapped because they were 50 years old. The Old Bay Line had fairly new steamers. But when war broke out, the War Department took the Old Bay Line, 3 steamers, fairly new steamers, and the newest steamer, the Chesapeake Line. So they were faced with no steamers, and they had to keep the city of Richmond, the city of Norfolk, on the Norfolk run. Some people said they were held together by baling wire and wax, but that wasn't quite true. The company spent a lot of money on them, keeping them freshly painted and tearing out inside staterooms and making larger staterooms. But then those 2 steamers were pretty old when they in 42 continued on to the end of the line. Yes, I went down because I knew they were making. Well, I had made the next to last trip on the city of Norfolk. Passengers weren't allowed to go because they were from the winter of '61 till they stopped in the spring of '62. They carried no passengers to save money because the insurance rates were pretty high for passengers. So I went to see the president of the line. I asked if I could go down. He said he was awful sorry. He'd love to do it, but because of the insurance factor, he couldn't do it. So I thanked him and walked out the door. He said, "Of course, Mr. Wood, if you just went on board and I didn't know about it, there wouldn't be anything I could do." I knew the captain. So I went down. I had the president's stateroom. It was quite a trip. I was the only passenger on board, of course. So when they made that was the next to last trip. But on our last trip, both the city of Norfolk and the city of Richmond, yes, I went out on the lumber pier on Pratt Street and photographed them coming in. The city of Norfolk came into Baltimore on April 14th, arrived. That was her last trip. The city of Richmond the morning before.
That's really interesting. Now we get end of tape signal. Oh.
Kind of mileage. So they just called to say my Mercury is ready now. I'll go down tomorrow and get it.
Oh dear, oh dear.
Do you want me to say something about the fate of the city of Richmond, city of Norfolk?
Yes, I'd like you to begin kind of where we left off. You went down to Baltimore Harbor to record. I want your words as though you were talking along with those movies. So you start out and say, "Well, I went down to Baltimore Harbor when I knew there was coming in for the last trip," or something.
Unfortunately, the picture didn't turn out very well because it was early April, and it was pretty dark when they entered the harbor. But I did get some kind of a view of them coming in. The city of Richmond final trip arriving the 13th, and the city of Norfolk on the 14th of April. Now, the city of Richmond had an unfortunate end. Old Bay Line sold their 3 steamers after they went out of business, sold them in 1962 to a man who owned one of the successor companies, the Tolchester Line. He bought all 3 steamers for $50,000. Unbelievable. The city of Richmond was bought by a restaurant owner in Washington, and in 1964 he had her all filled up with equipment and whatnot. Was going to have her towed down to St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands to make a floating restaurant and a motel. There were so many ifs connected with her demise. If the tug that was supposed to come get her had been on time, she would have gotten down there, probably gotten down there because the weather was good all the way to the Virgin Islands. But the tug was late coming, 5 days late. When it started out, got down to Norfolk, the wind was kicking up out in the ocean, so they thought they better not go out for a while, so that held them up another couple of days. Then they started out, and if the tug hadn't broken down, she probably would have gotten down because the weather was good. But the tug broke down and had to go into Morehead City, Carolina, to be fixed up. And then when she was getting ready to bring her out again to make the rest of the trip, there'd been a hurricane that had come up inland, the Gulf of Mexico, but instead of coming out in the Atlantic, it had turned inward, and all the predictions were that it would go right on inward and blow itself out. But it didn't. It turned, veered suddenly, and shot out over the Carolina coast into the ocean, and caught the city of Richmond and capsized her. That was the end of her. The city of Norfolk was, 2 years later, was sold for scrap and towed up to Fieldsboro, New Jersey, and they were just starting to break her apart, scrapping her, and lightning struck her, and she burned. Only time I ever heard of a steamer being struck by lightning.
Can you tell us a little bit about the accommodations on the steamers? Some of them were quite elegant, weren't they? Grand big room.
No, I wouldn't say that. Now the Norfolk steamers had some couple. Even most of those were just two bunk above, a washstand, a chair, a mirror. They had a couple of them had what they call bridal suites. They were fairly large rooms with a bath in them. But the river steamers, the rooms were quite small. They also, some of them had what they call a bridal suite too, but that was just a bed in there, and the room was a little bit bigger, that was all. And there wasn't running water on those river steamers for some of them for years. Some never had them. Of course, at the end, they were used only as freighters, but electricity came in about the late 80s.
Some of these steamers were exclusively excursion steamers, weren't they?
Oh, that's excursion routes I talked about. No, they didn't carry. They didn't have state. Well, they might have had one or two staterooms on all-day trips. Somebody wanted a room, but no, they didn't, because they didn't go overnight anywhere.
Yeah, some of the. I think I saw a couple of pictures in your book about there were 3 decks of excursions headed over to Tolchester. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the Tolchester line? What you remember of it?
3 decks. What do you mean 3 decks?
They had three decks of people.
Oh, they had a freight deck, and then the saloon deck, and then the open deck behind the pilot house. Yeah, they were really jammed with people. I think someone figured that the company, the Louise, which was the most famous excursion steamer on the bay, was acquired by the Tolchester Company in 1882, and she ran to Tolchester until 1925, and then was sold in New York. Somebody at the company estimated that she carried 250,000 excursions to Tolchester during her career here.
The Tolchester Beach was a pretty famous place. It was. You remember anything about that? Were you ever there?
Oh yeah, sure. I've been to all those places. Well, it became famous, as I said, because liquor wasn't served on board, so people, a wife could take her children along and not know she wouldn't be bothered by people getting half drunk. They had a nice little beach here. It wasn't a real big beach, but they had a hotel, racer dip, all kinds of amusements. It was quite a family place. And it was a short run. It was only a 2-hour run from Baltimore, whereas the run to Chesapeake Beach, which is the longest on the bay down below Annapolis, was about a 3.5-hour run.
It was interesting in the comparison between the old sternwheeler Mississippi and Delta river boats compared to the Chesapeake Bay sidewheelers.
Well,
twin stacks and one stacks and different type of engines, weren't they?
oh yeah, inclined engine. Not, they never had a walking beam. Now, they also had side wheels, some of them. Most of them were, no, like in the early days, most of them were paddle wheels on both sides, but a number of stern wheelers too. See, the walking beam here on the bay for the side wheelers was a tremendous engine, and you wouldn't believe all the moving parts in that thing. And yet, it was a very efficient engine. And the Emma Giles, which was a well-known Colchester Company steamer, had her engine from the Nellie White, which had foundered in 1886. They put the engine in the Emma Giles, newly built. And the Nellie White's engine had come out of a boat that was lost during the Civil War. So at the time the Emma Giles was scrapped in 1937, or made into a barge, her engine was 80-some years old. That's how efficient those things were.
Were those triple expansion engines?
No, not. I think you think of screw steamers, or propeller steamers.
Yeah, I guess that's
they
right,
were they were triple expansion. Yeah. Then some of the later side wheelers on the bay eliminated that tremendous engine with an A-frame and a walking beam, went back and forth, and they had inclined engines, still side wheel, but they were going this way along the freight deck instead of up and down.
And the early steamboats were wood-fired, weren't they? And then
Oh yes, back until certainly about 1840, they all burned wood, and then they started burning soft coal. And all the river steamers right up to the end in 1939 burned coal. The old Bay Line converted to oil in 1933, so they had oil for a good almost another 30 years.
Well, I remember you talking before about the river boats that went up the river. Some of them up the Rappahannock and the Patuxent went a long ways up, serving little tiny wharves.
On the Patuxent route, there were 45 landings just from the mouth up to the head of navigation, which was originally Bristol, but then later Lyons Creek. But it was so narrow up there that they, after unloaded, they couldn't turn around. They'd have to back down a quarter of a mile down the river to a little basin there and turn around and come on back down the river. The Rappahannock River line was a long run, 122 miles down to the mouth of the Rappahannock, and then 100 miles up the Rappahannock to Fredericksburg. And they made about 40 landings, back and forth across the river.
Well, it must have been, like you said earlier, it must have been interesting, standing on a wharf like that, waiting for the white steamboat to round the bend with the smoke belching from the funnel. And it was an era of different type of transportation. Of course, the bay, ever since people began settling along the bay, it was the avenue of commerce. It was the means of transportation until the roads came in the 20s.
No, when the steamer came in to those landings, because most of them were just landings, a little village or town sometimes, no cities, Cambridge, Salisbury. One line ran all the way up the Nanticoke River to Seaford, Delaware, 40 miles up the river. But it was quite an event when the steamer would come in. Any of the lands of people would come down and see her come in, talk, visit.
I guess it was quite interesting too, because watching them bring on oxen and cows and sheep and pigs, and
they'd have one of the deckhands would grab it with the tail, and the other two others would have a rope around its neck and pulling it while it. I remember one time I was on the water, one of them broke loose, and the deckhand dove overboard. It was fairly shallow water, but the thing was running around the wharf.
Well,
Sheep they would carry on They just pick up a great big deckhand would pick up a sheep with one arm and walk it on up.
And all of the smells and that goes along with it, I guess that was all contributed to the ambiance of.
You would think with the sheep, pigs, and cattle, that just one deck below your stateroom that you would, but you didn't often get that smell coming up. Would have been pretty bad if you had.
Well, it was an era that you lived in, and did you ride every steamboat that ever came to Baltimore?
Not everyone, but
Almost all of them.
most of them. Yeah. Mhm.
Did you ever go up through the canal to Philadelphia?
Mhm. That was an interesting trip going through those locks, because those steamers, the Philadelphia steamers, originally were, as I said, were tiny little screw steamers, 110 feet long. But then as the line prospered in the late 90s, 1890s, they built steamers that were 200 feet long. Now, can you imagine a steamer 200 feet long with a 22-foot width? Had to be to get through the locks. You'd see them coming towards you, it looked like a pencil. The side wheeler, only 165 feet long, would have a 40 or 50-foot extension out over the guards. Quite a difference.
And they were all steel hulled, weren't they?
Oh, no. Most wooden hull.
Most of the steamboats were wooden hull?
In the early days, and then starting in the 1880s, they went to iron, and then 90s steel. But there were nothing but wood from the hull up. And it's just amazing that more of those steamers didn't catch fire because they had water buckets, they had hoses, but gosh, the hoses looked as if you could punch a hole through them, and when they did have a fire, they weren't very effective. Water buckets up on the top deck didn't do any good. So you would think it was an adventure to take one of those trips, but actually from 1885 to 1925, it's 40 years, only about 15 of them burned. And you figure the fire going, and sometimes sparks coming out of the stack.
Do you have any memories that you might want to share with us regarding the port of Baltimore and steamboats? Something unusual, or other than the city of Norfolk?
Well, when they left in the afternoon, in my time, when I started going down, the river steamers, Norfolk steamers left at 6:30, York River Line 6, but the Philadelphia steamers and all the river steamers left at 5 o'clock. Now you can imagine them all trying to back out from Light Street, Pratt Street at the same time, and got tangled up a few times, and one trying to get way ahead of the other. So it was quite a congestion there in that inner harbor there when they were all getting ready to go out.
And as a young lad, and even after that, you were able to identify a steamboat merely by its shape.
Oh, sure.
Not write its name like boys can do with airplanes, and we used to be able to do with sailing ships. If you'd see a gaff-rigged sailing ship.
Yeah, people often ask me, how in the world can you tell it's this one or that one? They all look the same to me. They'd say, well, it's like, how'd I know what you look like compared to somebody else? It's just little differences that you got to know.
Well, I find it's an interesting era in which you live, and this production, I think, will be greatly enhanced by your commentary. Anything else that we failed to
No, I can't
talk about?